All right. Well, hello, everyone. We're excited today. Welcome to Deliberations Live. I'm your host, once again, Derek Caldwell, with author and speaker Abdu Murray. Abdu, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Derek. Great to be with you and
Yeah.
our special guest coming up soon on Deliberations Live. Thanks so much for doing the great job you do of hosting it.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to just real quick, I want to thank Diego for jumping in today and helping us last minute for our Lance is usually here, but he couldn't be here. If you're the praying type, and I have a feeling most of you are, go ahead and say a prayer for Lance and Carol today. They could use that, and our obviously where our prayers are with them. But I want to go ahead and introduce. Enough about us, Abdu.
Yeah,
We've
enough
got
about
a
you,
we've
that's for
got a
sure.
yeah, enough about me for sure. Yeah. Um, we've got a special guest today, someone who's been so incredibly has impacted our own faith so much. He's a friend of yours, friend of the ministry. So I just want to go ahead and welcome in now Dr. Hugh Ross. We're so excited to have him here answering questions on a podcast that he appeared on with you previously on All Rise, talking about some comments Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson had said. So Dr. Ross, welcome to your first deliberations, where the jury deliberates and asks you questions.
That sounds like really fun.
Yeah, it usually is. We've got a lively bunch a lot of the time. So yeah,
We do, in fact.
Yeah.
So who's joining us so far? We see some people joining up and joining with us. We also got some lively questions in the comments section of the video itself. So we're going to be addressing some of those, as well as some folks tune in live across the various platforms: Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. I did tweet about it, by the way. If you don't already follow me on Twitter, I'm on just Abdu Murray, ABDUMURRAY on Twitter. While we're not live streaming on Twitter, I did put the link up, so we should get some folks that way too. So
yeah. By the way, Abdu, whenever I try to look you up online on my phone, I don't know if it's my fat fingers, but I'll spell it ANDU because the N is right next to the B, and it autocorrects to Andy Murray, and I'm always getting stuff for this tennis player, and I don't know anything about tennis, and I don't want to know anything about it. So so I get very angry. So consider changing your first name, or getting him to change his. Whoever one of you needs to budge on this.
Exactly.
We've had enough. Yeah,
exactly. I've had enough.
But So Gregory, our friend friend of the channel, Gregory, is joining us. Sam, who asked some awesome questions recently, is joining. Greg asks great questions too, and Mike Adams joining us. Hello to all of you from watching on YouTube right now, and I know we've got some on Facebook and Instagram as well. But I wanted to start today, as we give time. We've got questions to ask. We're going to let some roll in on the live chat. I hope everyone enjoyed Dr. Ross's appearance on All Rise, responding to some claims from Neil deGrasse Tyson. We just recorded another All Rise with him that'll be out in a few weeks, and on the James Webb Space Telescope, which was very exciting, had a lot of fun. But we thought it would be fun. Hey, we went to, Abdu talks a lot about artificial intelligence, and it's the new thing. And we thought, why don't we ask ChatGPT? We said, hey, we've got Hugh Ross with us. What would you like to ask him about the James Webb Space Telescope? And this is verbatim what it said. So color me impressed by this thing, but it says this: this is the machine's words, from a biblical perspective, what are some specific areas of research or discoveries that you anticipate the James Webb Space Telescope could impact? And how might these findings contribute to our understanding of the Creator, capital C, and his purposes, capital H, for the cosmos?
Wow.
So they even got the Christian grammar right on that.
So what do you think, Hugh?
Yeah.
That's a great question. And, my quick answer is that the James Webb Space Telescope is basically targeting what about the early history of the universe? I mean, the Bible predicted Big Bang cosmology, at least 3 distinct features of the Big Bang creation model, thousands of years before astronomers even discovered that we live in a Big Bang universe. And that Big Bang universe basically predicts a certain history of the universe, including specifics on the early history. how the first galaxies and stars will form. So I'm excited about what I think within the next year or two, James Webb is going to be able to tell us explicitly what kinds of stars show up first in the history of the universe, and therefore what kinds of galaxies follow the formation of the first stars. We already got some insights. In fact, I'm working right now on an article I'm going to be putting up on our reasons.org website about the first discovery that basically is giving us an insight into what those first stars are like. And it's all 100% consistent with what the Bible predicted thousands of years ago.
Hmm.
Wow.
That's by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say during the course of this, by the way, I think the RTB folks, our good friends at Reasons to Believe, are actually on with us, watching, and hopefully doing whatever they can do to get the message far and wide that Dr. Ross is with us. Friends, go to reasons.org, reasons.org. They've got one of the most, frankly, impressive websites in terms of usability and searchability. And they have to, because there's so much material on there from their team. Dr. Ross has joined us a couple of times in various venues, whether it's coulda, shoulda, woulda, or it's the episode he just did with us, where he just recorded an episode on the James Webb Telescope, and then of course the one we're talking about, the Neil deGrasse Tyson response. But also Jeff Swearink and Fuzz Rana have joined us, and if I'm blessed enough, I'd like to have other members of the team, including Ken. I'd like to have Ken on, by the way, for a conversation about the Trinity. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, and Ken does an amazing job of talking about the Trinity. So we can probably spend a lot of time doing that. But anyway, we love RTB. Guys, check them out, reasons.org, for all this stuff, including and especially be on the lookout for this article that Hugh's working on right now. So, there you go.
As one of my roommates used to tell me when I was in seminary, if you're not reading reasons.org, you need to get your life together, bro. So you just got to get on there. There's so much good stuff that you're missing out on if you're not doing it. But yeah, so it's so helpful. So I want to jump into the first question that actually Gregory asked in the comments on the YouTube channel. And there's a follow-up to it that I want to get to. But first, this one's very specific to you, Abdu, but I'd love to hear Dr. Ross's insights as well, because he brought up, he remembered an old video of you, Abdu, sharing your testimony, and in it you said that one of the things that made you believe Islam was true when you were a Muslim was that you believed that the Quran had accurate scientific information, and that there's no way that people in the 7th century could have known that. So he said, I would be curious to hear what specific things you believed in this regard and what changed your mind.
That's a great question. And I actually would love to have Hugh jump in on here as well, because I know that RTB actually does work around the world. They got a team, Asia Pacific team, some folks located in India, some people who I admire greatly. But also you guys did some wonderful work working along some scientists who are Muslims in Turkey, I believe it was, a few years ago. So I'd love to hear Dr. Ross's response on some of these things as well. From my personal perspective, so I'll break it down into two areas. The first one was, what things did the Quran say that seemed to be scientific claims that I thought were impressive and therefore indicated it was from God, because no one in the 7th century could have known those things. And then what changed my mind about those things? A couple of those things were things like, there's several categories. Some of those categories were things that sounded like no one in the 7th century could have known them. But when it turns out, you look at just some of the observational abilities, these aren't terribly remarkable claims. One classic example is the idea that the Quran predicted that the atmosphere would get thinner and thinner the higher and higher in altitude we go. Well, there are mountains in the Middle East. It's not like it takes a whole lot of observational and computational power to figure out that the atmosphere gets thinner. All you do is walk up there and realize that you're out of breath far faster than you were before. The barrier between salt and fresh water. The Quran seems to suggest that there are some currents and rivers of barrier between salt and fresh water, and that there's an impassable barrier between the two, and that there are currents within the bodies of water themselves, and these kind of things. Again, it seems impressive in one sense, but all you have to do is basically stand at the mouth of a river, dumping into a saltwater body, and you'll pretty much find out that by and large, you're not going to get a lot of mixture where the salt is going into the fresh water for various reasons. So there are some things like that. There's a significant amount of embryology, for example, where there's discussion about human development in utero. Within the Quran. What started to change my mind were a couple of things. Is that when you started to look at the claims, many of them aren't that impressive. And it's not an insult to say that. What I'm saying is that a lot of the things that Muslims are now claiming, or recently in maybe the 80s and the 90s were claiming, were scientific things that the people couldn't have discovered back then. A lot of Muslims don't claim that anymore because they're like, yeah, that was observable. We're not going to bank on that one. And to their credit, they're actually not relying on those. But there are some that seem a little more scientifically specific, but a lot of them, it's an interpretation. You're forcing a scientific interpretation on something that can be problematic, like the idea that the Quran says that mountains are essentially the peg that creates the stability of the earth. When in fact, what we know through plate tectonics is the exact opposite. Mountains are the evidence of the instability of plate tectonics and the way the earth actually works. Where the sun actually sets, there's a passage in the Quran that suggests that the sun sets in a pool of muddy water. Whether that's meant to be literal or meant to be figurative is another issue altogether, but you can't use that as scientific proof because it's clearly scientifically wrong. And then I believe it's in Surah 86, might be 82, I might be getting my number wrong, but there's a discussion about embryology, and God is talking about in the Quran about how humanity is this marvelously made thing by God himself, and says something like, has not man considered from what he was created? He is created from a drop emitted from between the backbone and the ribs. In other words, whether it's semen production or it's something else, whether it's the actual zygote that is sort of descends down the birth canal, etc., this is just factually, geographically wrong. None of this comes from between the backbone and the ribs. And so that is a problem, obviously. What I want to make sure I point out, though, is that it isn't those scientific issues that got me to steer away from the Quran. That wasn't it. These are things I sort of later discovered. It was the factual issue. It was the factual historical issue of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And did it actually happen? And when you look at the historical record, it's hard to deny, very hard, unless you're doing it solely on ideological grounds, that Jesus died on a cross. And then I would say it's even hard to deny that he rose from the dead based on the historical evidence as well. So those are the reasons that's what really changed my mind in terms of the factual issues, including the theological issues about Islam. But as far as the scientific stuff goes, even as a Muslim, I began to see some of the claims are a little overblown, and some of them ended up actually being wrong. But this was further on down the road. So they didn't change my mind in terms of me becoming a Christian. They were things that I began to see later on that I thought were impressive before, but really turned out not to be so impressive.
Yeah, Dr. Ross, did you have anything you'd like to add to that? Or,
well, I've got a book coming out in October of this year where I basically compare the attempts by Muslims to concord the Quran with the scientific record compared to how the Bible, we Christians, concord the Old Testament. And basically make the point that what you see amongst Islamic apologists, they engage in strong concordism, whereas Christians are able, on their dependence on the Bible, to engage what I call moderate concordism. Strong concordism, good example of that is Muslims will claim, you look at the Quran, it actually predicted that men will walk on the moon. But what you discover is the passage that mentions the moon is pages away from the passage that mentions people. There really is no explicit statement in the Quran. They're just taking what I call strong concordance, where you're forcing some scientific statement of the text that doesn't clearly come out of the text. Whereas with the Old New Testament, we can actually draw a lot of scientific content. We don't have to force it. We can use a moderate approach, because the Bible, unlike the Quran, is very specific about the scientific details of the present nature of the earth and also the past history of the earth. I mean, what brought me to faith in Jesus Christ was going through the first chapter of the Bible and recognizing it specifically stated the events of creation in scientific detail and put it all in the correct chronological order. And that was clearly way beyond the science of Moses, and it didn't have to force anything. It comes naturally out of the text. There really isn't dispute by people saying, oh, the Bible doesn't really say that. No, anyone who reads the Bible realizes, yes, the Bible really does say that. So what I'm doing in my new book is making a distinction between what I call soft concordism, where you basically take nothing out of the text, moderate concordism, and strong concordism. And what you see in not just Islam, but Hinduism and Buddhism, they all engage in this strong concordance apologetics because they got no other option.
So can I just ask a question? I'm taking away from our audience, but I think this is important for our audience to hear this. Speak, if you could, just for a couple of minutes or a minute or two on the caution for Christians to engage in strong concordism, because we have ample stuff in the Bible where we don't have to engage in that. But sometimes people do that. Sometimes people will force fit a reading into a text that sounds really impressive until you look into the context. You're like, it's not really saying that. Can you just caution some folks about the temptation?
I get a manuscript unsolicited sent to me, about once a week, where people are going through the Bible and say, wow, I actually see particle physics in this text. I read that particular passage and it says, I don't know how you're pulling fundamental particles out of that sentence there. That's an example of strong concordism. This is a passage that mentions Neanderthals. And so, wait a minute. The Bible explicitly declares this is a revelation for all generations of humanity. Therefore, we shouldn't expect it to be talking about neutrons or neutrinos or Neanderthals or dinosaurs, because these are things that only people in the 20th and 21st century be aware of. You'd be leaving out previous generations. On the other hand, we would expect the Bible to talk about things that would be understood by earlier generations, but understood in more detail by later generations. And so the Bible does have predictive power. And so, but yeah, it's a human tendency to read more into the text than what's there. But I also see the opposite effect where people read less into the text than what is there. And so it's like, we need to read the text carefully and just look at one passage. If this is really what the Bible is communicating, what's unique about the Bible compared to other holy books, it has dozens of long, lengthy texts on creation. The Quran, I counted just 3. But what you see in the Bible is over 2 dozen. And you can look at these different texts, look at what Job says, what Psalm says, what Proverbs says, look at what Genesis says, and hey, look for an interpretation that's consistent with all the creation texts in the Bible.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. Actually, you kind of in your answer there, you kind of pre-answered the follow-up I had from earlier, so we can move on. That was good foresight there. I want to. We got a couple live ones here, and one is a really good one. That's from Gregory again, and I don't know if this is one of those asking for a friend scenarios, or he just wants to know. He asked Dr. Ross, what advice would you give a young Earth creationist Christian who's heard good points for old Earth, but is worried that they'll be viewed as secular/atheist if they believe in an old Earth?
Yeah, well, it's interesting how secular scientists are reacting against the scientific discoveries that are establishing what the Bible's taught for thousands of years. And so it's like science is not the enemy of the Christian faith, it's the ally of the Christian faith. Every week that goes by, we come up with additional scientific discoveries that sustain our Christian faith. I mean, that's why I write a blog called Today's New Reason to Believe. I mean, if I had the time, I could write an article literally every day about new scientific discovery in the scientific literature that's making a stronger case for the inerrancy of the Bible and the reliability of the Christian message. In fact, if I had the time, I could write 6 a day. That's how much is being published in the scientific literature. And so it's a wonderful privilege to be alive in the 21st century. When the book of nature, God gave us two books, the book of nature and the book of scripture, but the book of nature is exploding. My own discipline of astrophysics, the knowledge base doubles every 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
So we shouldn't be shocked that we're getting all this new evidence.
Yeah.
So what do you think, though, as Gregory is asked, if you're someone who is a young earth creationist? I mean, one of the things that I've always loved, I'm going to sidestep here for a moment just because I think some context is important. I remember Fazrana and I were in Peru, and someone asked a question about young earth and old earth and that kind of thing, and he had a very diplomatic statement. Obviously, the folks at Reasons to Believe are old earth in a nuanced way. It's not just simply a simplistic way. It's simple but not simplistic. And he gave a really diplomatic answer as to RTB's position on this in terms of not breaking fellowship with Christians who have a young earth perspective and also those who have an old earth perspective. I really appreciated the diplomacy with which he said it, and also the unity with which he's encouraging people on this. So when you have someone like Greg, for example, who's asking the question, what if someone sees really good arguments for an old earth, but they're worried that if I allow for an old earth, what I'm allowing for is evolution. What I'm allowing for is not only evolution, but a mindless, blind chance evolution, or even multiverses where we're bound to get this kind of a universe at some point, kind of a thing. Speak to someone like that who's worried that old earth equals a hair's breadth away from naturalistic.
Well, first of all, I'd point out this is not a salvation issue. It doesn't show up in any of the creeds of the church. When you read the early church fathers and the patristic fathers, they wrote thousands of pages on Genesis chapter 1. Almost all their focus is on who creates and how he creates. They write very little on when he creates because they saw it as a non-essential. And today we know enough that now we can discuss it. The early church fathers realized, okay, science doesn't have a lot to bear on this, although it is interesting. Many of them did take an old earth perspective even back then. But the second point is the billions of years is of no benefit to any naturalistic model. And this is particularly evident in my own discipline of astrophysics, because in the early part of the 20th century, there was a major debate. Is the universe quadrillions of years old or only billions of years old? And those that were promoting the quadrillions were saying, we need that much time to save naturalistic biological evolution. If it's only billions of years, we can't save Charles Darwin. We can't save a naturalistic interpretation of life. So often I'll share with my young earth creationist friends, look, we only differ by 6 zeros. We both differ by literally thousands of zeros with those who take a non-theistic perspective on the origin and history of life. And that helps them to relax and say, okay, this is not something we should break fellowship over. Let's actually look at all the biblical evidence and say, it's not enough to take the Bible literally. We have to take it consistently. So we do it Reasons to Believe. We look at all the creation content in the Bible, take 100% of it literally, but we also take it consistently. What is the interpretation that ensures that no biblical text contradicts another biblical text?
Yeah,
that's good. Good advice. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, I love that you bring that up. When you look into the early church, often they're debating, they're wondering, why did he do this with time at all when he could have done it all instantaneously? And a lot of their answers, and ancient and medieval rabbis too, came up with a similar answer of this was meant to show that it wasn't by mere chance, but that he took his time out of his abundance of care for us to prove to us that he cares for us. And so almost
Augustine, as he does make the point, God does perform his miracles instantaneously. He just doesn't perform them all at once.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you're old earth or young earth, when you look at the account of the 6 creation days, obviously there's a time sequence in God performing his miracles. So how rapidly God does the miracles is not the issue. We both agree that God does it instantaneously.
Yeah.
It's over what period of time he performs his creation miracles.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I'm gonna jump back to the YouTube comments, and then I'm going to go to the live. But we've got one here that was from Michael Griffione, who was, clearly not a Christian, looks like, and had some criticism of the discussion. And he said, to him, it looks like there's a lot of verbal contortion going on here. Dr. Ross spends a lot of effort explaining that there are many ways to interpret words. What I get from this is that the Bible means whatever you want it to mean. This runs contrary to what every Christian church leader wants us to know about the Bible. We are told the Bible is, quote unquote, absolute truth. Now, according to Dr. Ross, we are supposed to believe that we are supposed to not follow the words of the Bible, but rather our interpretation of it. So very critical there, but we all have to interpret it. I mean, so what would you say to that? Is there a plain reading that we're overlooking, or what's going on?
Well, there is a plain reading. I mean, as I look at the creation text in the Bible, I see nothing in the text that indicates that we should be taking this figuratively or metaphorically.
Mm-hmm.
I also see that, particularly in the book of Genesis, there are many textual clues that we're to take this historically, chronologically.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the days are numbered, the fact that you see the repeated phrase, and it was so, and it was good, and how there's an evening and a morning for each of these days. This is clearly indicating a chronology. So I think we can move past that. What he may be referring to is, how I will often make the comment that certain Hebrew words have multiple literal definitions. And what you notice is this debate, for example, over the age of the earth. It's a debate that it flourishes in modern languages which have huge vocabularies. It's a major debate for English language speakers, Japanese speakers, Korean speakers. Those are all languages with more than 500,000 words in their vocabulary. English having 4 million words. Biblical Hebrew has only 3,000 words if you don't count the names of cities and people. And virtually every Hebrew noun has multiple distinct literal definitions.
Mhm.
The word for earth, arest, that's used in Genesis 1, has 5 distinct literal definitions. The word for day, yom, has 4 distinct literal definitions. And we know that because you look at Genesis chapter 1, it clearly uses 3 different definitions for the word day. Creation day 1 is using the word day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it uses the word day for 24 hours. It's contrasting seasons, days, and years. But Genesis 2:4 uses that same word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. So this is an epoch of time, a long finite period of time. So how do you tell in the passage which of the definitions you should use? You look at the context.
Mhm.
Also look at other biblical texts. There are many creation texts in the Bible. Go look at what Job has to say. In fact, there are more scientific details about the events of the 6 days of creation in Job 37, 38, and 39 than there are in Genesis 1. Take a look at that. Psalm 104, the longest of the creation psalms. It also takes you to the content of the 6 days. So there's guides to the interpretation. Yes, we all interpret, but the wonderful thing about the Bible is it gives us multiple texts on creation, and therefore we can put to the test our interpretation. As I said, not only take it literally, but take it consistently. The consistency gives us, I think, the best test of whether or not our interpretation is correct or faulty.
And when you look at, I have 2 things that springs to mind and gets me thinking about this, Hugh, is that first, when you have a statutory construction or a contract construction interpretation, you're taught this in law school. You look at the 4 corners of the document, because even English, with its 4 million words, we still have to struggle sometimes with what does that word mean in this paragraph of this contract, or in this statute, or in the Constitution versus this other one. So if we didn't do that, we would have no need for a Supreme Court. We would have no need for courts at all. We're constantly trying to interpret things based on their context. So even with your point is so well taken, because even with a language with 4 million words, and they're getting more and more specified, we're creating new words all the time, we still have to go through interpretation. Just because we go through interpretation doesn't invalidate the inquiry, or somehow it makes it ad hoc, or we just make it up as we go along. That's not it at all. We do this all the time with highly specified languages like English. In fact, I can think of a word right now that has 2 literal meanings, and they're both common. The word foot. If I say foot and I just say it without context, is it the thing at the end of my legs, or is it literally 12 inches long of a span? And if I say my foot hurts, now we know what I'm talking about. But if I say that's 1 foot long, now it might be referring to the length of my foot, but we know what I'm talking about. We're talking about the actual length of time. So even complex and specified languages and evolved, so to speak, languages require interpretation. How much more so with something like Hebrew with biblical Hebrew with 3,000. But I love what you said, that the Bible gives us the tools, almost as if God were anticipating this language of limited vocabulary is going to need some interpretation. So I'm going to help you and give you the interpretation
Well,
needed.
let me give you an example. It tells us in Genesis 1:2 that darkness covered the surface of the deep.
Mhm.
I remember reading that at age 17 and saying, okay, it must be dark because of the clouds that covered the earth. Because it says in Genesis 1:1 that God created the universe.
Mhm.
There would be light in the universe, but it was dark on the surface of the waters. But then you go to Job 38, verses 8 and 9. It explicitly tells you why it's dark. It says, God blanketed the seas with clouds that kept the seas dark. So that's the way of affirming the interpretation of Genesis 1:2.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that you'd see when you see consistent rules applied, and those rules, by the way, don't just apply to just the biblical document. We apply those same rules to every document we ever read. You're not being ad hoc. Now you can see if someone's being ad hoc because they're violating those rules, those time-tested rules of hermeneutics and interpretation. So that's a great. Thanks a lot to you. I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah, I want to. So let's jump back over to the live chat. We've got some questions from Sam. Just real quickly for Sam, the old Earth versus young Earth thing. Young Earth is basically if you take the plain reading of the English translation of the Old Testament and you see the word day, that you interpret each one of those as one literal day. And so the creation week was 6 literal 24-hour periods, which was roughly 6,000 years ago. Old Earth would be taking the literal understanding from the Hebrew text behind the English translation, understanding that there's sort of lexical elasticity in the word yom, as Dr. Ross just explained, and that comports more with the idea of a billions of year old universe, and so what we would call an old Earth view. But he asked, and so this is a question. I don't know if he's asking Dr. Ross because Dr. Ross is a doctor and a scientist, but it's about the transgender movement. He wants to hear from a scientist on it, but I don't know if that's anything you've ever focused on, because you're astrophysics, and that's gender studies or biology, or whichever field we want to put that in. But he's just asking, if you want to weigh in on that, or Abdu, you feel free, because you've written on this and researched this, and I know Abdu, you and I are currently reading a lot on this. What from a scientific perspective, what do we make of that that movement, I guess?
Yeah, do we have basically he's asking, is there any scientific evidence for there being more than 2 genders?
Right.
Now I realize
in
this
human
is
beings. Yeah,
in human beings. Yeah. So I realize this is a bit of a hot button issue, Hugh. It was asked, obviously, from a scientist's perspective.
Well, it is a hot button issue, but the Bible is explicit that God created us male and female. So from the biblical perspective, there are 2 genders for humanity. And now I think there's 57 different genders that people have invented. But the fact that we've seen this as a recent phenomena in the sexual revolution, I don't see people talking about 57 different human genders 2,000 or 10,000 years ago. So it's like, what's going on in modern society that is proliferating a new gender virtually every week. And there's probably some non-scientific rationale that's going on here. So the question is there a scientific basis for more than two genders? No. Is there a biblical basis? No. We need to look elsewhere for what's generating this recent proliferation of all these genders.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there is some discussion about whether is the brain morphology is different, or you see some chemical issues going on that cause someone to might have gender dysphoria, or a way in which the chemical issues that during the course of fetal development or development thereafter might cause some kind of a sense of dysphoria. In other words, dysphoria where what you feel in your mind is different than your body actually is telling you, based on its chromosomal makeup, but also its it's not only its genotype, that which is in the genes, but also its phenotype, the physical manifestation of these things. And so there is some discussion about whether or not there's any kind of brain science behind this kind of thing. But that even in and of itself doesn't suggest that there are actually more than two sexes or more than two genders, as opposed to thinking maybe this is a reason for someone to have a misperception about their gender. And so even that kind of delving into the biochemical stuff wouldn't necessarily justify a belief that there's anything else outside of the binary of man and woman. Our experience of it might be tainted by or influenced by some kind of chemical imbalance of some kind, but that doesn't mean that chemical imbalance dictates reality. It just dictates the reality of our misexperience of it. And there is, I think, some really good social science to be had out there. And this is not me just as a Christian speaking about this, by the way. There's a book that both Derek and I read by an atheist named Helen Joyce called Trans, when ideology meets reality. And she goes into a lot. This is somebody who, as far as I can tell, has no love affair with biblical Christians, who says, hey, there's a lot of social science behind this movement as being more than just about reality. It's more about ideology. So if you're looking for not three guys who are sitting on a panel talking about this thing from a Christian perspective, but you want an actual person who has no dog in the religious fight whatsoever, in fact, has a dog in the opposite of my beliefs, I would look at Helen Joyce's book.
Yeah, excellent. And I know I'm going through Deborah So's book right now, The End of Gender, and she was in that world, did that research, was in sort of the research of sexology, was very progressive, and started to see some things that weren't quite true, and ended up changing her mind and wrote this story. And still not a Christian, as far as I can tell, not one at all, but is very much concerned about the movement. And there are other people speaking up like that at the risk of their even their tenure. So we should take those voices pretty seriously. And I just want to circle back a little bit too. Earlier, I want to apologize. I said Michael Griffione was not a Christian. I don't actually know that. He may have just had a question and is struggling with something. So I don't want to put that on him, and I apologize for overstating that if I did. He may not be, but we got a comment from Gerard Maloney, who said it's no problem debunking Neil deGrasse Tyson. By his own admission, he is not intelligently designed. So I just thought that was funny. I wanted to toss that in there. I don't know that it's charitable, but I thought, that's clever. Why not toss it in the show?
Yeah.
But one that we got that I thought was interesting from the screen name phenylalanine, which I'm assuming is not the first and last name, but talking about the idea, again, this was kind of critical of the way Christians talk about this and say they cherry pick issues of the Earth's creation and reinterpret it in a way that fits science. Then they say, I'd like to see you use the scientific method to explain Noah's Ark, the Exodus, flying creatures created before land animals, Eve made from a rib of Adam, God making the earth stand still, humans living for hundreds of years, one language until the Tower of Babel, giant hybrid human angels, and on and on. And their point is saying we Christians start with a belief and then try to make the science fit. Now, that there are so many things, you're not going to be able to get to each one, but again, a lot of those are talked about on reasons.org and through the publications of Reasons to Believe. But overall, how would you, either of you, sort of start to approach that and say, even like is there something we just need to understand about Scripture first before we make a claim like that, or where do we go?
Yeah, it's a very good. I mean, right now I'm writing a book on Noah's flood, and basically saying, well, let's first look at what the entire Bible says about the flood. We're not just going to look at the text in Genesis. Noah's flood is mentioned in multiple books of the Bible, but what you see, particularly in the New Testament and the creation Psalms, it's making the point: it's the world of ungodly people that God flooded. And in terms of who is wiped out, it's the ungodly people and the animals associated with them. And what you see in the book of Leviticus, it's only the birds and mammals, which are soulless creatures according to the Bible, that can be damaged by human sin. And so right now we're saying, okay, it needs to be a flood that wipes out the world of ungodly people at the time of Noah. Well, when did Noah live? Does the Bible give us any indication? All it tells us in Genesis is that it took a little more than a year for the waters of the flood to recede. Well, that's a long time for a flood to recede. And to get the water to last that long, you need a lot of melting snow and ice. Because if the waters recede, they flow it into the ocean. Well, what's replacing the water that's flowing into the ocean? We've had major floods in the Mississippi Valley that lasted for 4 months. The reason why, the water that went into the Gulf of Mexico was replaced by water from a heavy snow melt from the winter before and hot sun bearing down on the snow slopes of the source waters of the Mississippi. All this tells us that Noah's flood must be an ice age event. Okay, now when we're pushing the flood that far back in time, sometime during the last ice age, you also notice that Genesis 10 and 11 talk about a dispersal of humanity from one locale into all the continents of the world. Well, we have DNA evidence that tells us that event began to happen about 40 to 45,000 years ago. So again, this puts Noah's flood back at a time where the conditions of the ice age can help us understand what the text is saying. And so what you're basically doing is going through the Bible and getting all the details first before you compare it with the scientific record. And so, because you got a lot of Christians claiming it was a global flood that inundated all the high mountains, including the Himalayas. Does the biblical text sustain that? It doesn't. It says the world of ungodly people was flooded. 2 Peter 3, it says the world that existed at that time. If the text meant the entire surface of the earth, the Greek word cosmos would have no qualifications. The 2 times it's mentioned in the New Testament, it's always qualified. So what Peter is doing is contrasting the world of Noah with the world of Rome, both of which were less than the entire planet. But where you get the most explicit constraint is in Psalm 104, which speaks about creation day 3, when water covered the whole surface of the earth, and then God transformed the earth so we now have continents and oceans. That's verses 6, 7, and 8 of Psalm 104. Psalm 104 verse 9 says, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. So it's basically saying the moment you got continents, never again is water going to cover the whole face of the earth. That's repeated in Job 38 and 3 other creation Psalms, and then Proverbs 8. So you got multiple biblical texts telling us we're not looking at a global flood, but we are looking at a flood extensive enough it wipes out all of humanity, all the animals associated with them, except for those on board the ark. And then for people to say, well, there was such flood happening, there's actually more accounts of the flood that wiped out ungodly people in the cultures of the world than there are creation stories. Over 150 different cultures of the world and all the continents of the world, except for Antarctica, where people weren't dwelling, they all have a flood story. How do you explain the fact that every ancient people group had a flood story if there was no flood that impacted a large chunk of the human population.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring that up, Hugh, because one of our viewers, Dr. Octagon, asked the question. I hope Dr. Ross he includes the older sources of the Epic of Gilgamesh in terms of the flood account, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is but one flood account. There's ancient Chinese accounts. There are some other areas around the world that talk about a flood account. I was actually recently asked this on an open Q&A. I didn't say Japan. I said China, Dr. Octagon. But there are. I was asked this about what do we make of this? Is because there's two ways you can interpret that, right? You can interpret it as there are flood accounts in other cultures, which just suggests that this is like an archetypal kind of a story. It doesn't really happen. It's just the kind of thing that creeps up in cultures every so often. It's like a hero myth or a apocalyptic myth that creeps up, and so you see it in other cultures, and that doesn't mean it really happened. It just means that this is the kind of theme people think about. Or you could have the other interpretation is like, well, multiple sources from different cultures are saying something happened, and they don't seem to be along the lens of allegory in terms of they're using an allegory. The Epic of Gilgamesh uses a flood narrative in the allegory or in the mythological story, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. So speak to that a little bit if you could, because you mentioned the Epic of or the flood stories of Gilgamesh and others. Speak to that, like what do we make of the fact that there are other cultures that have flood accounts?
And it literally is ubiquitous. I mean, there's a Dutch scholar, historian, Ellen von Vold, who documented there's over 150 stories about an ancient flood in the different cultures of the world, North America, South America. It's literally everywhere. And, people say, well, there's just every human group has some kind of disaster. But the fact that it's always a flood disaster, they're not talking about volcanoes, hurricanes, whatever. It's always a flood that wipes out all these ungodly people. And so there's a consistency there. Now, there's a lot of differences between the Gilgamesh epic and the Bible, more differences in their similarities, but where they are saying the same thing is that there was this huge water flood that wiped out everybody except for those on some kind of vessel. I mean, that's kind of a common denominator you see in all these stories. So the fact that you see such a similarity amongst all these diverse different cultures and people groups tells us there had to be some flood event that had a dramatic impact on people living tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at some of those differences too, because it's within the Genesis account where it's God's love for humanity. He's actually trying to save humanity through the flood, whereas in other accounts, the gods are sort of, or one in particular is sort of annoyed by the sound the humans are making, so he tries to kill them, and then the others get mad because with most of the humans wiped out, no one can sacrifice to them. They're getting very hungry, and so they save one, and so it's like it's even that the heart of the message is so different.
Yeah, that's the Gilgamesh epic, because
Right.
basically gods are unhappy with humans. The
Yeah.
Bible is saying this is God's act of mercy. He's
Yeah.
realizing that humanity is in danger of self-extermination, so he intervenes to save the righteous from the wicked. And also, if you look at the Gilgamesh epic, the boat isn't seaworthy. It's basically this circular thing that has equal dimensions. It simply wouldn't work. And even the ancients were aware that a vessel of that nature wouldn't be able to last long in a long flood. And then the stories of which animals are taken. So there's huge differences. And the differences you see in the Gilgamesh epic cannot be supported scientifically, whereas the ones in the Bible can.
Yeah.
So we got some friends who are joining us from the other parts of the world. We got someone coming in from Mauritius. That's fun, and also Northern Ontario. Sherpa, hello, hi, nice to see you. She's saying hello to all of us, as well as who's from Mauritius. Let me look up real quick. From Arley, Alabama, Linda is tuning in. And let's see, where's the Mauritius one? My goodness, I know some folks in Mauritius. I don't know if this is a person I know. If I do know you, I apologize for not saying hello.
Clement.
Oh, there it is, Clement. Depends on, are you saying it biblically like Derek is saying Clement, or are you saying it Clement like we would normally say it now? But anyway,
Clement
hi.
of Mauritius. Hello.
Clement of Mauritius. Yeah,
Greetings
exactly.
in the Lord.
Yeah. Sounds very biblical.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple more minutes there, Derek. Let's
yeah, we got a couple more minutes, and I want to go back a little bit because one question that we got, and I know it's a popular question that we get when we talk about, so specifically comparing these creation narratives, but specifically the biblical narrative. Dr. Ross, earlier you said that the chronology was correct, and that's what led you to believe that it was true well before we knew scientifically that these things were true. And someone asked in the YouTube comments, basically on the question of the issue of the light and having plants, the idea being, well, we have plants before sunlight, we think. How does that work out? And was it just the light that was already there that could sustain before the sun was available? Or so how do you resolve that issue in the text?
Galileo has said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong frame of reference, the wrong point of view.
Mm-hmm.
The frame of reference for Genesis 1:1 is a universe. In the beginning, God created the universe. There'd be matter, energy, light in the universe. Genesis 1:2 changes the frame of reference. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. That's the point of view from which we're to interpret the 6 days. It's dark on the surface of the waters because the light of the sun, moon, and stars was blocked out by the early Earth's atmosphere. What happened on creation day 1? Let there be light. The atmosphere was transformed, where sunlight and starlight can now come to the surface of the earth. What happened on creation day 4? Let there be the great lights, so they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. This is the first time the atmosphere became transparent, so the creatures on the surface of the earth for the first time could see the objects that are responsible for the light. And it's important to see that it uses the verb haya, translated let there be. God did not create the sun on the 4th day. Rather, the sun appeared to creatures on the surface of the earth for the first time on the creation day. When did God create the light? In the beginning, when he created the universe. But it says, let there be light on creation day 1. This is when light first appears on the surface of the earth. So it's crucial we get the correct frame of reference.
And I think this is a really great answer because there is, the first question we got from the YouTube comments was, it seems like an ad hoc interpretation. It's only ad hoc if you don't actually have evidence or a good solid hook or a reason why your interpretation should change. In other words, if we don't have a biblical reason or a textual reason to shift the narrative from the general to the frame of reference of the earth, well, then it would seem ad hoc, but you just explained it's not, because there is a reason to shift the frame of reference now to the earth. And when you see 2 great lights, one to govern the night and one to govern the day, where? On Mars? I mean, our moon does not govern the night and any other planet but ours. So you can obviously see, and you pointed this out, by the way, in Navigating Genesis. And by the way, I wanted to do a little object lesson here. I did it in another broadcast, but I have a stack of books from Reasons to Believe. That's about half of the size of the stack I have of the material that Reasons to Believe puts out. And Navigating Genesis is one of these ones where Dr. Ross goes through the chronology and the biblical reason to think that these are not just ad hoc ideas. This is something that comports with modern science. And that responds, by the way, to one of the, or at least addresses one of Dr. Octagon's questions in the chat, where he said, so the answer to the question is we start with the Bible first. In other words, I think what he's asking is, are we saying we go with the Bible first because we presume its authority over everything else? And so is that where we are going? Are we going there first and then trying to fit everything around our interpretation of the Bible? But I think that's not what you're saying, Dr. Ross.
It's not what I'm saying. I mean, I looked at the other holy books, the religions of the world, before I picked up the Bible, and I made a commitment. I'm going to put all these books in the best possible interpreted light. And when I did that with the Quran, when I did that with the Hindu Vedas, there were errors and contradictions that I couldn't, put in any possible good light. And so I put those books aside. With the Bible, I put it in the best possible interpretive light. And I was prepared to throw it away if I could find a provable error or contradiction. But I couldn't find any provable errors or contradictions. There were texts I didn't understand, but the texts I did understand, I discovered this was all consistent with what I understood. And I did have the advantage that I've been studying astronomy since I was 7. So when I saw that there was darkness over the face of the earth, and when Job 38 said that God had blanketed the seas of the early earth with clouds, well, I knew enough to realize Earth started off with an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. I mean, it's a natural thing. The bigger, the more massive the rocky planet, the farther away it's from its star, the thicker will be its atmosphere. Venus has an atmosphere 90 times thicker than the Earth. Earth started off with an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. But we now know that the solar system started with 5 rocky planets. The 5th one, Theia, collided with the proto-Earth. And it was that collision that stripped away virtually all of Earth's water and all of Earth's atmosphere. And so that explains how it is that light could penetrate through the atmosphere. God made sure there was an event that would transform our planet from having a very thick atmosphere to having one thin enough where visible light could penetrate through the surface. And then we have an oxygenation event that happens at creation day 4. And we now know the more oxygen you put in the atmosphere, the less haze you have in the atmosphere. So the early Earth for the first 3 creation days had an atmosphere that let light through, but the haze was so thick that no one could see the objects that were responsible for the light. The great oxygenation event that happened before the Avalon explosion, where oxygen jumped from 1% in the atmosphere suddenly up to 8%, that was enough oxygen so that Avalon animals could survive for the first time, but that oxygen also cleared the atmosphere. So those creatures could actually see the sun, moon, and stars. And one thing about animals that's different from all their life forms, they need to know the position of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to regulate their biological clocks. The plants don't need that, but the animals do.
Well,
Yeah.
hey, Derek, one of the Sam asked a question. I think this is a great one to wrap up with.
Yeah.
Because I think it encapsulates everything that just happened. And I want to say one other thing too before we get to this question to have you respond to it. You look at the Bible first if you want to know what the Bible says. So yes, it is the chief authority for interpreting the Bible is the word of the Bible itself. Just like we look at every single contract, like we look at every single statute, every law. We look to what the document itself says about the document itself, and then if it's unclear, we can look to outside things. It's called parole evidence in law. There's other ways to look at this kind of stuff. So we look there first. But I love the way your respect for the book of nature and the book of Scripture, his revelations to us are harmonizing, and you don't assume one. You don't assume your interpretation of the Bible is correct, and who cares what science says, nor do you assume what the science says and then say, I don't care what the Bible has to say. You try to see if they can line up. So the last question, why don't you take the last question that Sam had in terms of the God of the gaps? Do you see it, Jared?
Yeah. So Sam just asks, and I know we are out of time, but this came and I was like, oh, we got to answer that. You can't just leave that alone. So we'll try to get you something good here, Sam, quickly. But he said, what about, he's heard the argument, the God of the gaps. They used to plug God into every scientific ignorance in the past, but now science has advanced to the point that we see there's so many things that science has found we don't need God anymore. What would you say about, do Christians today still fall into the God of the gap? Is that what we're all doing here? And does science not need God anymore? Is that what science has actually found?
Well, every model has gaps. I mean, we humans are never going to know everything about the universe or everything about the Bible for that matter. And so what we need to do is look at the gaps in our interpretive model and compare it with the gaps in the competing interpretive models. So you got the God of the gaps, you got the no God of the gaps. And so there are gaps on the atheistic side. I mean, a classic example of that is research on the origin of life. There are huge gaps there from a naturalistic perspective. And so what we do is we look at the gaps in the different competing models and say, well, we need to dig deeper. Let's do more research. Let's be more extensive and comprehensive in our research. And let's see what happens to the gaps. And so in my interpretive model, if the gaps are getting bigger and bigger as we learn more and more, the gaps are getting more and more problematic. That tells me I probably got the wrong model, or I need to make major revisions to my model. But if the gaps are getting smaller and smaller and less problematic, and that probably means I'm on the pathway to truth. And so we need to contrast what's happening to the no God of the gaps with what's happening with the God of the gaps. And so and gaps are our friend. They're basically our tool for learning more. And so we need to welcome the gaps and say, hey, this is an opportunity to really see whether I got the right interpretation or not, whether or not I need to make revisions to my model. And my experience is whenever I resolve a gap in my biblical interpretation, it reveals more gaps that I didn't even know were there. But the new gaps are less problematic. And if they're less problematic, that tells me, hey, I'm onto something. But those new gaps I didn't even see, it's an opportunity for me to dig deeper. So the gaps actually help guide our research. And so we've been engaging origin of life researchers with this very approach. Okay, let's welcome the gaps or understanding the origin of life. We have these different models. Let's look at the gaps and see what happens to them as we learn more and more and more. And what I've noticed when I attend origin of life research conferences, the people that are coming from a non-theistic perspective, with each successive meeting, they're more depressed than they were at the previous meeting because the gaps are getting bigger and bigger and more numerous. And so as we engage in over meal times, we're saying, maybe there are alternative models that'll do better. And it really opens up some really good discussion.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that as we wrap up, you've conjured up two things I want to say real quick. The first one is, guys, if you listened to this entire episode, and it's going to be posted again and available later, Hugh's response on the God of the gaps and not running away from it and trying to explain the idea away, but this discussion of the comparison of the two, that is worth you listening to a couple of times or watching a couple of times. I've actually never heard anybody, maybe I'm just not well read enough. I think I'm pretty well read, but I've never heard anybody actually embrace the idea of gaps and then say, but whose gaps keep getting bigger or more problematic? That's the issue. Boy, that approached it from a humility of not knowing everything, but it also approached it from its fair and proper comparative perspective. I just really appreciated that. Folks, watch that again. You have to watch that part again. I'm so glad we took a little extra time to do that. And second thing, and this is how I'm going to wrap up, I think the time we had together, outside of just thanking you, Hugh, for the time you gave us today. We did an interview earlier today. By the way, check it out, friends. It's going to be on the James Webb Telescope. You're really going to like this one when it comes out. But also this interview itself and taking the time with the viewers and the listeners' questions. Hopefully we've respected everybody's intention in asking those questions, and hopefully we answered you, not just your question. I'm going to say this, is that last bit, when we have these gaps, these are impulsions for us to go and research more and go search out the truth, and we find delight in these discoveries because the gaps might get smaller and smaller, or even if they're more numerous, they're less problematic. Reminds me what Chesterton said. Chesterton said, for the Christian, joy is the gigantic secret, because although the peripheral questions lack answers, the fundamental questions are answered. But for the skeptic, it is joy that is peripheral, because while the peripheral questions might be answered, it is the central questions that get wider and wider in their gulf. And so I think you just beautifully, from a scientist's perspective, gave real tangibility to this wonderful sentiment from Chesterton. So Dr. Ross, Hugh, my friend, thank you so much for
Yes,
being on
thank
this.
you.
Thank you to your team for helping to coordinate this. Hey, RTB guys, thank you so much. Love you so much. And to our listeners, thanks again for the wonderful, engaging questions.
Yep. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
All right.
Take care.